Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we can present our review of the new AMD RX 7800 XT and the RX 7700 XT, landing here in the UK at £480 and £430 respectively. AMD is firmly targeting the mid-range, taking on the likes of the RTX 4060 Ti and the RTX 4070. But how will these two new GPUs stack up over 12 games that we benchmarked, plus another 8 with ray tracing enabled? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. And yes, we did benchmark Starfield. So after the initial announcement at Gamescom 2023, it's now time to review these two new graphics cards. We also have confirmed pricing, as I briefly mentioned in that introduction. So the $499 US 7800 XT is landing at £479.99 here in the UK, while the $449 7700 XT is coming in at £429.99. I'm just going to throw up the specs on the screen here kind of as a refresher, and while I won't talk through all of them as there's quite a lot for two GPUs, I do think it is important to clarify the positioning of these two new products. The 7800 XT, for instance, despite its name, is much more of a mid-range card than the 6800 XT. For one, it's launching with an MSRP that's £120 lower than the 6800 XT, while it's also built on the Navi 32 silicon, unlike the 6800 XT, which used the biggest Navi 21 die. The 7700 XT though is much more of a continuation of the 6700 XT, launching at a very similar price point, but it does actually come beefed up with 54 compute units instead of 40. For all of our testing today then, we are of course using our regular GPU test system, which is provided to us by PC Specialist. This is built around Intel's i9-3900KS CPU, and that's paired with the Gigabyte Z790 Gaming X AX motherboard, and we've also got 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB DDR5 memory. All of the benchmark data you are going to see in this video has been collected completely from fresh over the last 2 weeks using the latest drivers at the time that I started. So for AMD, we're using the 23.8.1 Adrenalin driver, and for Nvidia, we're using the 537.13 driver, while the 7800 XT and 7700 XT were tested with the press driver that AMD provided to us. In case you didn't know as well, while we do have a reference 7800 XT, there's no reference NBA 7700 XT card, so instead AMD sent us the Sapphire Pulse model, which is a stock clocked card. The final thing to say then is, in this video I'm going to be focusing on the 1440p and 4K data, as I personally feel that's most relevant if you're going to be spending £400 to £500 on a new graphics card in 2023. Of course, I did test 1080p though, so if you want to see that, as well as every one of the 220 charts that I produced for my two reviews, you can head over to the written articles, which will be linked down below, but you can just head over to the kitguru.net website. With all that out of the way then, it's time to dive into the benchmarks, and let's get cracking. Our first game benchmark of the day then is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, with the RX 7800 XT managing over 100 FPS at 1440p. That puts it 5% ahead of the RTX 4070, while it's 6% faster than its predecessor by name, the RX 6800 XT. The RX 7700 XT meanwhile delivers 90 FPS, putting it level with the RX 6800. It's also 13% faster than the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, and it's 20% ahead of the RX 6700 XT. Up at 4K, the 7800 XT still delivers a very playable experience, offering 62 FPS on average, while it retains a 5% advantage over the RTX 4070. The 7700 XT 2 is still decent, with a reasonable 52 FPS on average, and that's a significant 19% lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB. It's also a 27% generational uplift versus the 6700 XT. Cyberpunk 2077 is a strong showing for the RX 7700 XT. At 1440p it delivers 73 FPS and is not far behind the RX 6800 XT, while it outclasses the 4060 Ti 16GB and the 6700 XT by 32 and 39% respectively. The 7800 XT meanwhile is only 7% slower than the RTX 4070 Ti, and it holds a commanding lead over the RTX 4070 to the tune of 18%. Up at 4K, neither GPU offers a super smooth experience with an average FPS of 40 from the 7800 XT, but using ultra settings this is still a highly demanding game, and the 7700 XT is on par with the RTX 4070, so a pretty good result for Team Red. Next is Forza Horizon 5, where at 1440p the RX 7700 XT is on par with the RTX 3070 Ti 8GB. It only has a small 7% lead over the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB though, while this is actually the first game where we see a performance regression for the 7800 XT when compared to the 6800 XT, as it comes in 7% slower at 1440p. At 4K though, performance between those two GPUs is now equal, both delivering around 80 FPS, while the 7700 XT sits at 66 FPS on average, making it 13% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. God of War also runs really well on the 7700 XT. It's actually level with the RTX 4070 at 1440p, and it's a whopping 37% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. The 7800 XT also delivers 108 FPS on average, and that makes it 17% faster than the RTX 4070, and again, only 7% slower than the 4070 Ti. At 4K though, those margins do shrink significantly, but the 7800 XT still comes in 7% ahead of the 4070, delivering a pretty smooth 60 FPS experience. The 7700 XT meanwhile does fall away slightly, but we're still looking at a commanding 22% lead over the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, while it offers 26% more performance compared to its direct predecessor. The generational gains in Horizon Zero Dawn are again more muted, with the 7700 XT holding a 17% advantage over the 6700 XT at 1440p, while it's also 7% slower than the RX 6800. The 7800 XT is also performing identically to the 6800 XT, while it comes in 5% faster than the RTX 4070. That gap though shrinks to basically nothing at the 4K resolution, with all three of those GPUs I just mentioned occupying essentially the same space, all averaging just over 70 FPS. As for the 7700 XT, it is still pretty playable with an average frame rate of just below 60, while it's also 16% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. We do see more of a gap between the 7800 XT and the RTX 4070 in The Last of Us Part 1 though, where the AMD GPU holds a 13% lead over its Nvidia rival, delivering 80 FPS on average in the process. The 7700 XT also hands out a beating to the 4060 Ti 16GB, outperforming it by 27%. Up at 4K however, the 7700 XT can't keep its 1% lows above 30 FPS, so you would want to tweak some image quality settings, and we also see the 7700 XT fall 14% behind the RX 6800. The 7800 XT does better though, holding 12% advantages over both the 6800 XT and the RTX 4070. Moving on then, things are much better for the 7700 XT in A Plague Tale Requiem. At 1440p it delivers 57 FPS, which is fairly low, but this is a very demanding title, but that still makes it 26% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB, and it's a 36% uplift over the 6700 XT. The RX 7800 XT meanwhile is still locking horns with the RTX 4070, delivering over 60 FPS at 1440p, but there's not a whole lot to split between them. 4K is a tough ask in this title though, as it is very heavy on the GPU, and we see the 7800 XT deliver 38 FPS on average using ultra settings, while the 7700 XT can't keep above 30 FPS at all times, so you definitely want to tweak the image quality. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is next, and this is a new addition to our benchmarking suite, and it's safe to say AMD GPUs don't fare too well in this title. It's actually the only game tested where the 7800 XT came in slower than the RTX 4070 by 10% at 1440p. That said, Nvidia GPUs do appear to have some issues with the 1% lows, which is apparently due to the direct storage aspect of the game. The 7700 XT is only slightly behind the 7800 XT here, and it holds a 7% lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB. Up at 4K, the 7800 XT is still lagging behind the 4070, and it's equal to the 6800 XT, delivering a 13% lead over the RX 6800. The 7700 XT, meanwhile, is 3% slower than the 6800 and manages just over 40 FPS on average using the very high preset. Up next is Red Dead Redemption 2, and this is another very strong title for Team Red. At 1440p, the 7800 XT is good for 81 FPS, and that makes it 15% faster than the RTX 4070, and it's only 9% slower than the 4070 Ti. Even the 7700 XT is within touching distance of the RTX 4070, despite being significantly cheaper. It's also 29% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. Up at 4K as well, the 7800 XT does even better, still managing over 50 FPS at max settings, delivering a 16% advantage over the RTX 4070. 4K is just about manageable for the 7700 XT, provided you are happy with 40 FPS or so, but that's still 31% more frames than the 4060 Ti 16GB, despite both GPUs being priced at £430. As for Resident Evil 4, this is a very smooth experience at 1440p using the RX 7700 XT. With an average of 98 FPS, it's only 7% slower than the RTX 4070, but 28% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. The 7800 XT meanwhile holds an 8% advantage over the RTX 4070, and it's within just 3 FPS of the 6800 XT. 4K though is still playable at maximum settings, as the 7700 XT delivers 55 FPS on average, and that puts it just 3% behind the RX 6800. The 7800 XT also pulls 16% clear of the RTX 4070, likely due to the Nvidia GPU's narrower memory interface. It's also just 4% faster than the 6800 XT. Returnal is up next then, and this is another new game I've added today, and it puts the 7800 XT and 6800 XT dead level at 1440p. The new Radeon GPU does hold a slender lead over the RTX 4070, but we're only talking a 6% margin here. Meanwhile, the 7700 XT finds itself in a three-way tie with the RX 6800 and the RTX 3070 Ti, while it still convincingly beats the 4060 Ti 16GB at 1440p. Up at 4K as well for the 7700 XT, it just about manages to hold its 1% lows above 30 FPS, delivering a 30% gain over the 6700 XT in the process. The 7800 XT meanwhile comes in 10% faster than the 4070, while it's just 5% ahead of the 6800 XT. Lastly then, we close up with a look at Total War Warhammer 3. This title shows decent gains for the 7800 XT over the 6800 XT to the tune of 11% at 1440p, though it's barely any faster than the RTX 4070. Things are again very closely matched between the 7700 XT, 6800 and the 3070 Ti at 1440p, with all three GPUs hovering around the 85 FPS mark. And then up at 4K, the 1% lows do actually drop off on most AMD cards I've noticed, but the 7700 XT remains competitive with the 6800, while it still comes in 15% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. The 7800 XT is again on par with the 4070 in terms of its average frame rate, with the exception of the 1% lows, which are slightly worse. As for what all of those games mean then for our performance summary, over the 12 games I tested, the RX 7800 XT delivers solid performance at 1440p. It only comes in 3% faster on average than the RX 6800 XT, though do remember the products are positioned quite differently. It's also 7% faster than the RTX 4070 and 17% ahead of the RX 6800. If we compare it against the RTX 4060 Ti's 16GB, which did launch at the same price, it's a massive 44% lead for the 7800 XT. As for the 7700 XT meanwhile, this GPU is highly competitive with the RX 6800. In fact, at 1440p there's barely a 1% difference between the two GPUs. It also comes in as a 23% uplift versus the 6700 XT, while it's 21% faster than the similarly priced RTX 4060 Ti 16GB. 4K is obviously more of a challenge, and the 7700 XT can't always get the job done at ultra settings, but it is again still 21% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB, while it delivers a 25% generational uplift compared to the 6700 XT. The RX 7800 XT though is a more viable option for this resolution, this time coming in 5% ahead of the 6800 XT, while it's still 7% faster than the RTX 4070, but it's actually now holding a 48% lead over the 4060 Ti 16GB. Just to illustrate the comparison as well between the 7800 XT and the RTX 4070, here's a breakdown of all 12 games tested at 1440p. We can see 4 titles where the 7800 XT was more than 10% faster, the 18% lead in Cyberpunk 2077 being particularly impressive. 5 games showed less than a 5% margin between the two GPUs, while the 7800 XT was only slower in one game, being Ratchet and Clank. Likewise, for the same comparison between the 7700 XT and the 4060 Ti 16GB, it's a pretty one-sided affair. At worst, the 7700 XT is 7% faster than the Nvidia GPU, but actually in 10 of the 12 games tested, we see at least a 10% lead for the 7700 XT. In fact, half of the games tested show more than a 25% advantage for the 7700 XT, despite both GPUs retailing for £430. As for what that data means in terms of cost per frame, looking first using the launch MSRPs, we can see that the 7800 XT is a clear leader. At 1440p it offers 23% better value than the RX 6800 XT, while cost per frame is also reduced by 24% compared to the RTX 4070. The main question mark is that the RX 7700 XT is actually slightly worse value than the 7800 XT also launching today, which is unusual considering the cheaper card usually offers more value, but that's not the case here. Still, at 1440p, the 7700 XT's MSRP equates to a 17% reduction in cost per frame compared to the 6700 XT, while it's also 19% cheaper per frame than the 4060 Ti 16GB. Cost per frame based on current retail pricing is a slightly different story, however, with just a 5% improvement at 1440p for the 7800 XT over the 6800 XT, which I found for £490. The RTX 4070 is now available at £570, though the 7800 XT is still 21% cheaper per frame. The 7700 XT, on the other hand, is actually slightly worse value than the 6700 XT, which I've now seen on sale for less than £320, with the newer GPU coming in 11% more expensive per frame. It is still better value than the 4060 Ti 16GB at £430, however, offering 17% better value. Just before we move on to ray tracing then, I did promise you Starfield benchmarks. I've unfortunately only tested 4 GPUs here. I would have loved to test more, but simply ran out of time after retesting all of the GPUs for this review with the latest drivers. But I did still want to show performance of the new AMD GPUs in this game. Just be aware that these results don't count towards the 12 game average or our cost per frame metrics, as I didn't test all GPUs. It's purely an extra benchmark so you can see performance in this brand new title. It is undoubtedly a GPU heavy game, as I've found, and at 1440p the 7800 XT barely averaged over 60 FPS in the new Atlantis area. That is still a huge leap ahead of the RTX 4070 though, to the tune of 25% at ultra settings. At 1440p the 7700 XT isn't able to maintain 60 FPS using ultra settings, but it is however on par with the RTX 4070 despite being priced significantly lower, and it also comes in 38% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB. 4K resolution though is too heavy for the 7700 XT without adjusting image quality settings or enabling FSR, but the performance is still on par with the RTX 4070, which is highly impressive. The 7800 XT also struggles a bit more, only delivering 40 FPS, but it is still well clear of the RTX 4070. Starting off our ray tracing benchmarks, I'm going to focus at 1080p resolution purely due to how much of a hit there is when you do enable ray tracing, so it is the most viable resolution. In control then, with ray tracing set to high, the 7800 XT manages 72 FPS at 1080p, making it 14% slower than the RTX 4070, but it's 8% ahead of the RX 6800 XT. The 7700 XT also delivers a decent experience at 1080p with an average of 61 FPS. That is a healthy 33% uplift versus the previous gen 6700 XT, and it's even a smidge ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB. Cyberpunk 2077 though, using the RT Ultra preset, tells a very different story. Not only is the RX 7700 XT 16% slower than the 4060 Ti 16GB, it can't even hold above 30 FPS at 1080p. Even though it's a rather hefty 47% faster than the RX 6700 XT, that doesn't really mean a whole lot at this frame rate. The 7800 XT is also struggling to break past the 40 FPS barrier. It is still a 12% improvement over the 6800 XT, but it lags behind the RTX 4070, coming in 31% slower. Based on those results then, using the RT Ultra preset in Cyberpunk 2077, it probably goes without saying that trying to use the RT Overdrive path tracing option is frankly a disaster on these AMD GPUs. Even at 1080p with balanced upscaling in play, the 7800 XT barely hits 20 FPS, and the 7700 XT is even worse, so it really is a night and day difference compared to Nvidia's 40 series cards. AMD's options come in between 60 and 70% slower. F123 though is eminently playable on the 7800 XT, even with all of the RTFX set to their highest quality levels. At 1080p for instance, the 7800 XT averages 75 FPS and is just 7% slower than the RTX 4070. The RX 7700 XT is even outperforming the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB by a not insignificant margin. It's actually 14% faster at 1080p, delivering 67 FPS on average. That also makes it a whopping 55% faster than its predecessor, which is a very impressive generational uplift. Hitman 3 is relatively okay on the 7800 XT as well. It is highly demanding, but that applies to all GPUs. At 1080p, the 7800 XT is just 13% slower than the RTX 4070, but again, it shows huge gains over the 6800 XT to the tune of 21%. As for the 7700 XT, it only manages 42 FPS at 1080p, putting it roughly level with the 4060 Ti 16GB. Up next then, we come back to Ratchet and Clank, and this is a very tough one for the RX 7800 XT. At 1080p, it only delivers 44 FPS, making it 41% slower than the RTX 4070, and it's just about level with the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB. The 7700 XT also loses heavily to the 4060 Ti 16GB by a 33% margin, no less. Returnal, however, is very playable at 1080p, with the 7700 XT delivering over 60 FPS on average, and it's only 4% slower than the 4060 Ti 16GB. Likewise, the 7800 XT hits 76 FPS on average, making it 8% faster than the 6800 XT, while it's 15% slower than the RTX 4070. Lastly then, we finish with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, one of the first games to get ray tracing support all the way back in 2019. With just an implementation of ray trace shadows, it's much less demanding on the 7800 XT, as it's able to hit over 100 FPS at 1080p. AMD still lags behind Nvidia in this game, however, with the 7800 XT being 25% slower than the RTX 4070. The 7700 XT also delivers over 90 FPS at 1080p, and that makes it 8% slower than the 4060 Ti 16GB, but it comes in 24% faster than the 6700 XT. On average then, over the 8 ray trace games I tested, we can see that the 7700 XT is a pretty sizable upgrade over its predecessor for ray tracing, delivering 38% more performance. It is still 12% slower than the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, but it's not a mile off. The RX 7800 XT is itself pretty much in line with the 4060 Ti 16GB, coming in around the 60 FPS mark on average. Nvidia hardware though is significantly faster in certain games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Ratchet and Clank, but the 7800 XT is competitive in others like F1 23. All told, however, the 7800 XT is 26% slower than the RTX 4070 for ray tracing at 1080p. Let's hit pause on the benchmarks for a minute though and change things up, as it's time to take a look at the cards themselves, starting with the 7800 XT. For this one we do have the reference model with its stylish black metal shroud and backplate, while the overall design perfectly slots in line with the other NBA cards. This time though it features just 2 fans and they're spaced around 3cm apart, while each fan measures just under 90mm. The card itself is 260mm long, 2.5 slots thick, and it's barely taller than the PCIe slot at approximately 130mm. On my scales as well, it weighed in at just over 1.1 kilos. Power meanwhile is delivered by 2 PCIe 8-pin connectors, and we can also note the 3 DisplayPort 2.1 connectors as well as 1 HDMI 2.1. As for the Sapphire RX 7700 XT, as a reminder there's no reference card for this model. Instead we've got the Sapphire Pulse, and it looks very similar to the Pulse 7900 XT I recently tested in a 44 game benchmark. This does mean a mostly black plastic shroud but with a few red accents, though it is outfitted with a metal backplate bearing the Pulse logo and ECG signature styling. It's also a dual fan model using Sapphire's angular velocity fan blades, each measuring 100mm across. It measures in at 280 by 128.8 by 52.6mm according to Sapphire, and I weighed it in at just over 1 kilogram. Power is again supplied by 2 8-pin connectors, but interestingly Sapphire has opted for 2 HDMI 2.1 and 2 DisplayPort 2.1, so you do get an extra HDMI port compared to most typical allocations. Looking at thermal performance then of these 2 cards, as we've only tested one 7800 XT and only one 7700 XT as part of this day 1 review, the results here are really just to lay the groundwork for our upcoming partner card reviews. Both do look decent enough though, with the 7800 XT hitting 76 degrees for the GPU and 94 degrees for the hotspot, while the Pulse 7700 XT did run a touch cooler at 63C and 84C respectively. Thankfully, the reference 7800 XT is a very quiet graphics card as well, hitting just 35 decibels in our testing. That was with the fan spinning at 41% or 1180 RPM. Meanwhile, the Pulse card is even quieter. The fan spun up to just 26%, which was 1150 RPM, and it barely registered on our sound meter, with noise levels hitting just 32 decibels. I am very happy to report as well that neither card exhibited any audible coil whine during my testing. As for clock speed testing, again we've got no comparisons yet, but over a 30-minute workout in Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, the 7800 XT averaged 2334 MHz, while the 7700 XT ran a bit faster at 2541 MHz. It's also well worth looking at power draw, where we measure power draw of the graphics card only using Nvidia's PCAT tool, and we do this on a per game, per resolution basis. So if you want to see power draw figures for every GPU in every single game, well, you can find that on the written article on kitguru.net. Here though, we're focusing on the average results at 1440p, where both GPUs came in below their rated TBPs. The RX 7800 XT drew just under 248 watts, so that's about a 50 watt reduction in power versus the 6800 XT, while the 7700 XT drew 225 watts, which is almost identical to the 6700 XT. Nvidia GPUs are undeniably more frugal, however, with even the RTX 4070 drawing barely 190 watts. As expected, that does mean AMD's new GPUs are notably less efficient than their Nvidia counterparts. The RX 7800 XT, for instance, delivers performance per watt that is 17% less efficient than the RTX 4070, while the 7700 XT is 16% behind the 4060 Ti 16GB. Yes, the 7800 XT is notably more efficient than the 6800 XT, but actually compared to the 6800 non-XT, which is the most efficient RDNA 2 GPU, well then the differences really aren't that big. So that really does bring us towards the end of our review, and I have to say I have been impressed by these two new GPUs. They may not be perfect and they might not blow you away, but certainly for the case of the 7800 XT, I do think it's done enough to become our new go-to recommendation in this price tier. Starting things off though with the 7800 XT specifically, and I'll come on to the 7700 XT a bit later on, this is a very solid card for 1440p gaming, where it averaged at least 60 FPS in every game we tested using ultra settings. It is even a viable kind of entry-level 4K card, but you may need to drop down to the high or even medium preset for more demanding games like A Plague Tale Requiem or Cyberpunk 2077. For £480 though, it is 5% faster on average than the RTX 4070, which itself starts at £570 these days, while we actually saw it come in up to 17% faster in Cyberpunk 2077, plus it also has 4GB of extra VRAM. AMD is definitely not helping itself with the naming, however, as the 7800 XT is barely any faster than the 6800 XT, so you really do need to be aware of what it is you're buying. That said, I personally do feel that the 7800 XT has been positioned very differently to the 6800 XT. For one, it's launching with an MSRP that's £120 lower than the 6800 XT, while it's also actually got 3 SKUs above it in the stack. So it's below the 7900 GRE, the 7900 XT, and the 7900 XTX, whereas the 6800 XT was the only card below the 6900 XT back when these GPUs launched. Still, if we do focus on the price to performance that is delivered by this product, I personally do think it is a win for AMD. However, Nvidia really wouldn't have to make too much of a price cut to the RTX 4070 for it to be that bit more competitive. For instance, it's currently retailing at £570 here in the UK, and that makes it £90 more expensive. You do have to factor in DLSS 2 and DLSS 3 though, both of which are more mature than AMD's competing solutions, while its ray tracing performance is also generally superior, though not in every game, as we saw today. Power and efficiency is a big one though, with the RTX 4070 drawing about 190 watts compared to 250 watts for the 7800 XT, so Nvidia's GPU is a good chunk more efficient. With those advantages for Nvidia then, I really do think that if the RTX 4070 was even within £50 of the 7800 XT, then you really would have to stop and weigh up the options. As it is right now, however, with the 7800 XT being £90 cheaper, faster for rasterization, and offering 4GB more VRAM, I really do think for most people that would edge things towards AMD, but I wouldn't say it's quite a knockout blow. The RX 7700 XT though is arguably even more impressive against its Nvidia competition, launching at the same price as the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB currently retails at. And yet the AMD GPU absolutely batters the 4060 Ti 16GB, coming in 21% faster on average for the same money. Even in ray tracing performance, we found that the gap is not that big, with the 7700 XT being just 12% slow on average, and it's even faster in some cases, like F1 23. The only real problem for the RX 7700 XT is the RX 7800 XT. As it works out, the 7800 XT is just 12% more expensive here in the UK, yet it comes in 18% faster. So it's actually the more expensive card that offers the better value. I have to say, I just really don't get the strategy here, and to me it seems like AMD doing AMD things. After all, Scott Herfelman went on record and said there'd be similar levels of stock between the two cards, so it's not like the 7700 XT exists purely to upsell you to the 7800 XT, but AMD is hampering its own chances of success, as who wouldn't pay the extra 12% for 18% more performance and an extra 4GB of VRAM? Just doesn't make any sense to me, and I think that the 7700 XT needs to be £20 to £30 cheaper for it to make any real sense against its bigger brother. Ultimately though, I still think that these are two of AMD's strongest launches from the RDNA 3 architecture, particularly the 7800 XT. They may not be massive leaps forward in terms of performance, and to be honest, they mostly look good because Nvidia's offerings in this price segment are so weak, but as things stand, the mid-range is definitely swinging back towards AMD. That is going to do it for this video though guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up. As always, I want to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts on these two new GPUs down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and ding that notification bell so you won't miss out when we upload a new video. And why not come carry on the conversation with us in our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While there, if you feel like supporting us by picking up one of our brand new t-shirts on our merch store, you can find the link in the description. And again, if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even consider supporting us on Patreon. That is it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.